I met Andrea. Okay.
Sorry, let's start that again. We
No,
forgot to hit record
Andrew,
first. I
was
was
that
recording another thing, but yeah. Sorry,
Andrew, do you want
Andrea,
to
why
start?
don't you
Why don't you
yeah,
start?
why don't you start, Andrea?
Um, I started working in the theater. That was where my beginnings were, and it was sort of politically oriented and primary text oriented improvisational theater that we were doing. And then we moved on to a piece about mothers and daughters, and one of the women in the play was doing a commercial. And she happened to be on the set with an elephant. It was an elephant, right? And she came back and she said she'd met this great writer and that she'd invited her to become part of our company. And so Liz and I met and wrote a couple of plays together. And then I became a historian, and Liz was mostly writing, was totally writing children's books. And then after about 40 years, we decided to start writing together again. And in the meantime, I'd
Wow.
become a history teacher. I mean, I was teaching as part of the city university system, and I became dismayed at how little my students knew before they got me, and how much they had emerged from primary and secondary school without knowing. So I was really interested in addressing those issues.
Hmm.
And
And
I
Liz?
had, well, I had actually majored in history at college and had a wonderful Texan professor who was a great storyteller. And then I, as many people in the 70s, had a pretty checkered several years, but I ended up working for Senator Robert Kennedy, unfortunately, very shortly because the campaign was so short. So between April, when he started ran for president, and for anyone who doesn't, and then June when he was killed, I had a job and suddenly I had unemployment insurance. And one of my friends said, "You've always wanted to write. Why don't you use it and write?" So I started writing then in 68. But I always wrote a mix of, uh, some history, some nonfiction. And I love doing research. Even if I did, my life as a fifth grade comedian, I took a course in stand-up comedy. I love research. I love finding those little details that make writing for me come alive or me come alive, one or the other.
What about
Well,
the
we're big
elephant?
believers.
How did the elephant? No, no, just
Oh,
joking, just
yes.
joking.
Well, you've probably met many freelance writers, and we say pretty much yes and like an improv. So
Okay, good.
somebody asked me if I wanted to write a book, and I do love animals, about animal trainers who worked in Hollywood, but had an elephant that they were raising in their basement. So I said
Sure.
yes.
Who wouldn't?
Who wouldn't? Exactly.
Well,
Sorry.
we are big believers in our history shows that using comedy as part of teaching any topic, but particularly history, which has traditionally been, I felt of, I think, by a lot of people as dry and boring and dates and facts and figures, that if you can make it funny and entertaining, it A, becomes more memorable and easier to listen to, and B, less dire. And particularly with the week that we've just had over in your interesting country, finding
I
ways
always
to
tell my
laugh, I think, is important.
I
Yeah.
always tell my students that history is gossip about dead people. It's
Right.
I like that. That's good.
Yes. Well, let's for people listening, your new book, Witch Hunt, is primarily around the McCarthy hearings in the United States in the 50s. We've talked about that on this show for way too long. Many, 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 many hours we've talked about this, but I'm excited to hear Americans talking about it, and particularly, I gather the target audience for the book is teenagers. Is that right?
it is, but we've been surprised at how many adults have actually taken to it. I think for both of us, when Andrea taught and when we did theater and when we write, we aren't really thinking totally of an audience. We're thinking of what makes us laugh.
Right.
And I think coming back together, that was really what we were looking for.
Yeah, we act
And
stuff out together
mhm.
Right.
as we go along. And we each have
That's what we
favorite.
do. That's what we do. Yeah, yeah.
And we felt in the McCarthy period where teachers and librarians were attacked, how much humor really stayed in families, and they did, along with the tragic parts. But when people
Mm.
remembered their families, I loved someone who said when her mother was called before the House of Un-American Activities, and for people in Australia, that was exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah.
And she thought it was a house where her mother was going to come in as an American and go out as something else.
The lack
Which
of
makes
knowledge.
sense.
We
Yeah.
one of the guys who lived in Pasadena, who was a big fan of our show for many years and sadly passed away a couple of years ago, his parents were called in front of the HUAC. Well, his mother and his stepfather, I think it was, and he shared with us the transcripts of what they said in front of the committee, and it was pretty funny. I mean, they were very bold and pretty much gave the middle finger to the committee about what it was trying to do. But there was a lot of humor, which must have been hard to find, I think, at the time, but just standing up to the bullying that went on. One of the reasons I became interested in history in my early 20s was actually when I started to learn about McCarthy and the Red Scare. And I don't think many Americans appreciate this, but I was born in 1970. Growing up in the 70s and the 80s in Australia, we were pretty much another state of the American empire. It's a really weird um, it's a really weird experience to grow up completely smothered in the culture of a country that you're not actually part of.
Mm.
We had a little bit of British media still lingering from the 50s, but most of the TV, most of the film, most of the music, most of the books that we consumed were American. And we grew up watching Sesame Street, right? And I remember being quite upset as a young child when I discovered that Sesame Street wasn't even in my country. I couldn't even go there because it was in a distant land far away that was for special people who got to go to Sesame Street, and I was not worthy. But when I got into my late teens
You
and
had
early
only been a
20s,
frog.
yeah, or a large Mr. Snuffleupagus is what I felt like because I couldn't be seen by regular people. Which coincidentally is how Ray feels most of the time. That's just
Most
because
of
he's
the time.
short. People can't
Yeah.
see that
Go right
well.
over. Right over.
He just
Weird.
disappears behind furniture and stuff like that. Um,
Really?
when I started to learn about McCarthy and the Red Scare, and I grew up with this idea that the United States was a country that was proud of the fact that people had freedom of thought and expression and it believed in democracy. And so I had this cognitive dissonance around, well, how do you have a country that believes in those things, but then prosecutes people for believing in a particular political ideology and then hunts them down? And I'm still in that rabbit hole 35, 40 years later. I mean, the whole reason we do this Cold War show is to try and work out what really happened during the Cold War. And so I wanted to start. Your book touches on this, but obviously you want to focus on McCarthy, and I think that's great. It's important to have a central narrative that you want to get across. But from your perspectives, I'd love to start off by knowing where you think the anti-communist sentiment in the United States came from that led to the McCarthy hearings.
And Andrew, why don't you take this as our resident historian?
There are two parts of that, and one of them is about commun sort of McCarthy is about communism. But McCarthyism was not just about communism. It was about consolidating political power. It was about a shift in economics. It was the United States from the 19th century on was afraid of communists and began deporting them, in the 19th century whenever they got a chance. So they saw communists as dangerous, but McCarthyism is much more than a fear of communists. It's a fear of newness. It's a fear of America's new position in the world. It's cultural shifts. It's the effect of the civil rights movement, even if people at the time were not completely aware of the extent to which that was impacting their society. So those are all significant parts of McCarthyism because people weren't chasing communists. They were chasing people who somebody said were communists, who anybody said were communists. So that's a different thing.
And you also have to remember the Republicans had been out of power from FDR from 1934 to 1950s. So they really were looking, and in that time we had Social Security, we had World War II, but it was dominated by the Democrats, including the Southern Democrats, which were very segregationist. But it was a coalition that was very hard to break. And it started to fall apart, and the Republicans were really looking for a cause, and they found scaring people about communism was what they could use.
Yeah,
And there
we
were
loved.
issues.
Yeah.
I mean, there were. I mean, by this point, the Soviet Union was issuing threats, had moved through Eastern Europe, was expanding its empire. It's not a totally disconnected paranoid fantasy. Stuff was happening, and when the Soviet Union developed the atomic weapons, that became even more terrifying for people who'd been afraid of outside isms for a really long time.
Could I just respond to that real quick? Sorry, Cam. One of the things that Cam and I have covered in the show is to try to look at everything from different points of view. And when Stalin takes Eastern Europe and he doesn't give it back, it's not because he's the cruel despot villain twirling his mustache. It's because Russia had been invaded twice coming from the West, and and Stalin's like, this isn't going to happen anymore. We're going to hold on, because if we're going to fight in Eastern Europe and not on Soviet territory. So that makes sense. But that very quickly doesn't matter to the Americans, because the Americans are, from what I'm taking from your book, is the Americans are being told the most extreme, outrageous, this is the greatest threat to us since, who knows what, and they're communists everywhere. I almost feel like Americans in some way, we're naive. We were kind of isolationist, and then World War II comes along. We help fight the fight. We win. We're the good guys. We, to whatever degree, trust our government. And now our government is telling us absolutely horrible things about Soviet Russia. One, how can it not be true? And two, of course we should be afraid to the point where we need to do something about it. But I loved your idea that for the Republicans just trying to get back into power, it sounds like they took something that really wasn't all that real, but it was a political expedient to get back into power. And as we all know, politicians are practically willing to do anything to get back into power.
And some are. I mean,
no, when McCarthy started attacking Republicans is when he got into political trouble, when the tables were turned on him. I'm sorry, Liz.
Good point.
Well, I was just thinking the irony is that McCarthy was pretty lowly senator. And so when they were going out giving everybody plum speaking jobs, he got the ladies auxiliary in Wheeling, West Virginia, with
That's
one
right.
reporter there. but
Right.
he was the only one, and it wasn't. He was looking for a whole bunch of issues that would make him. He loved to be famous. From the time he
Right.
was in the army, he wanted to be, someone near South Pacific. He wanted to
Right.
be Kill Gun Joe. He loved being famous, and he was quite charming. But he
So a
had the idea of
politician,
naming people. He named a
right.
list. He said 216, and that stuck in everybody's head.
Exactly. Going in front of a bunch of ladies and being charming, being a male politician, being charming is one thing. Coming out with a specific, I've got 205 or whatever.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And of course, the irony here does not escape anybody about a male politician who loves the limelight, who loves to shock and awe, and he only wants more and more because he's almost like an influencer today. There can never be enough attention on
Yeah.
me. I mean, that's what I took from your book as far as McCarthy. He just loved it and ate it up.
Yeah. And he
Yeah, he
wasn't,
did.
and he could be reckless about it because Hoover told him never name numbers. Hoover was much more strategic. And of course,
Right.
Hoover lasted 50 years beyond McCarthy.
Exactly.
But
Because we're
Go ahead,
talking
Cam.
J. Edgar and not Herbert.
yes,
Yes.
Um,
Very important.
um,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, we had quite a few years ago. We had Doug LaFollette on the show, who was the Secretary of State of Wisconsin for many years, and his father, Joe McCarthy, was from Wisconsin, obviously, and his father used to battle it out with McCarthy a lot. So there's some interesting stories
that's
from his
how
father's
McCarthy
You
time.
got to
bet.
be senator. McCarthy got to be
Yeah,
senator for beating
Yeah.
his father.
yeah. So, but I want to go back to the beginnings of anti-communism, and the reason I'm harping on this is because I see a lot of parallels between how that came to be and what's happening today in the United States. Ray and I have done shows from everyone from Alexander the Great through the Roman Empire and, the Cold War, the Renaissance. One of the things that there are two things that we always say, three things. No one expects the Spanish Revolution. Sorry, the Inquisition, or the Revolution. One thing is that all politics is local. And I think that gets back to your point about Republicans using this as a way to consolidate their power. Another thing that we always harp on about is that people haven't changed much over the last couple of thousand years of recorded history. Humans are still driven by the same basic motivations. And the third rule is never attend a party thrown in your own honor, but that's a separate issue because usually you get assassinated. But when I look at what's happening in the United States and I look at the genesis of the Cold War, so you talked about them trying to get rid of communists in the 19th century. One of the things that we've covered is the United States had a lot of economic issues in the late 19th and early 20th century. There were a constant series of recessions. They were really struggling with their ability to manage their economy and sell all of the stuff that they were making, particularly because they didn't have access to global markets because they were controlled by foreign economic blocs, British Empire, French, etc. The Ottoman Empire up until World War One. And so then you have this you have the Soviet, well, the Russian Revolution leading to the creation of the Soviet Empire. There's a lot of fear in the United States around Bolsheviks and Bolshevism and what that could mean for the United States. But then, we start to see there's a lot of economic uncertainty, a lot of economic turbulence, and reading Ray and I are going to do a show on the election after this. So I've been going through all of the exit polling data. There's this concern that people have about the economy and how bad they're doing under it and all those sorts of things. This was very true in the early part of the 20th century as well. Coming out of World War One, people were doing it very tough. And then, of course, you go into the Great Depression. So Roosevelt pushes through the New Deal, and there was a lot of anger. I don't know if you've ever come across the National Association of Manufacturers, the NAM.
Yes.
There was, right. So you've got these guys. You had the first Red Scare in 1919, 1920, when there were bombs being sent out to political and business leaders by an Italian anarchist, not by communists, but it was blamed on communists. J. Edgar Hoover was given the authority to set up a radical division, which is where he got his start.
27.
Right, Palmer's Raiders. Yep.
Palmer's Raiders. And so people, I think, this is getting back to your point earlier that young people, I generally think most adults I've spoken to in the United States in the last 30 years don't understand this. They think, oh, well, we were anti-communist because of the Soviet Union and what they were doing in Eastern Europe or what they were doing to their own people and Stalin's purges. But it went way back. Before Stalin, anyone had ever heard of Stalin. Went back before anyone in the US had even heard of Lenin. It went back to, like, by 1919, the Bolsheviks had barely... They were still in the middle of their own civil war. They haven't even really taken control. And the US and the UK were sending troops to Russia to fight on the behalf of the Tsars, to fight with the White Russians. One of the reasons why there was obviously so much distrust between Stalin and Churchill and FDR, although he got along a lot better with FDR than he did with Churchill, is because these guys had sent armies into his country to support the monarchy. I mean, like, well before the Bolsheviks were even a political power, there was this belief that you had to crush revolutions. America and the United Kingdom were all about crushing revolutions in far distant countries that were trying to overthrow their governments. There was this fear in the minds of the elite in those countries that, well, if it happened there, it could happen here too. I did a series for many years on Napoleon where it was the same sort of thing. When the French Revolution was successful, the monarchs of Europe said, well, we need to crush that. Yeah. Because you can't let that shit happen. We can't let the people rise up against the monarchy. Where would we be if the people rose up against the monarchy, right? You can't allow that idea to take hold. And I think the same fears were had by the rich elite in the United States and the United Kingdom and around the world when they saw what happened in Russia. Well, we can't allow that to happen. And in the meantime, they've got people at home that are poor, etc. So then you got FDR pushes through the New Deal in the 30s, and the elite, the rich businessmen of America, hated FDR for the New Deal. They hated the idea of welfare. They hated the idea of unions. They hated, they were already shutting down viciously any sort of strikes that were happening in the early part of the 20th century. And then they figure out how to weaponize religion in the United States. We did a lot of long series on guys like Father Charles Coughlin, the Catholic radio priest in the 30s, who didn't get the gig. Exactly. And
exactly.
He hated the communists, but unfortunately also hated the capitalists as well. And so they weren't going to back him. He was calling FDR Roosevelt, which, as we pointed out, was his family's real original name. But he was an anti-Semite and an anti-communist and an anti-capitalist. He was all of the antis. And then they eventually find James Fifield, the pastor at the huge mega church, the first big mega church in Los Angeles, who then is able to co-opt religious leaders around the country to associate capitalism with Christianity and communism with Satan. Is it Satan? And they drive this wedge. Like I remember pointing out that FDR was part of this Christian movement that believed in social reform, that believed in taking care of your neighbor, that believed in taking care of the poor, that believed in ethics and morals, which was quite a large Christian movement in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. But then the large business leaders co-opted Fifield, gave him a ton of money to build a megachurch. He was known as the 13th apostle, the apostle to big business. And they gave him free access to the media, shades of Twitter, and he was able to, co-opt religious pastors around the country by saying, listen, if you want access to the big bucks, we need to start singing from the same hymn sheet, that Christianity and capitalism are bedfellows and are meant to be together. So I see the anti-communist thing in the United States primarily as a reactionary movement from the rich, wealthy elite to progressive politics, and an
And they went
attempt to shut down that and revolution.
and they went after easy targets. We called it witch hunt because the powerful go after the easy targets. It doesn't matter what either the Soviet Union was really trying to do. It was not the teachers and the writers in Hollywood. You were
Who were
right.
doing it?
Many of them came from the Depression, but many of them, when you said don't go to a party, many of them went to, these political events with their college roommates, and then they would lose their job because they had gone to a communist party. But honestly, they had gone to a party to meet girls.
You know,
So
Yeah.
I think there are other things that to it, though. It was Europeans who ran around in the 19th century whipping up the connection between capitalism and communism, and the idea of the contagion of communism, and especially after 1848 and that series of revolutions. But in the United States specifically, in the 1920s, the country was going through this tremendous upheaval and fear of outsiders. I mean, this obviously resonates, but this fear of immigrants, immigration was shut down in the 1920s. This fear of socialists, this fear of feminists, this fear. I mean, all of the people who Palmer um, deported, right, primarily fell into those same categories. In the 1920s, that's when the Scopes monkey trial happened. So there's this fear in the 1920s of isms and outsiders and European corrupt influences. It's, I think, very powerful. It's interrupted by the Depression and World War II, but just interrupted, and that sense of the fortress United States protecting itself is a pretty strong thing. That also it is specifically American and feeds into McCarthyism.
and what we were searching for was sort of the ironies. There's a second grade teacher in Massachusetts. She had in the 30s gone to a communist party, literally a party, dropped it, never paid her dues, and had become a teacher. And actually, really, she said she loved saying the Pledge of Allegiance. The FBI got their file to her school board, and she went before them. She pleaded to be allowed to continue to teach because she loved it.
Mhm.
She was fired. She then got a job at the SPCA, sweeping out, I'm sure I can say it on your podcast, shit, sweeping out dog poop. And the FBI went to the SPCA and said, you have a communist working in your dog kennels. What was she, turning the dogs communist? And she got fired. So it's
Jesus.
those people. I mean, you're in broadcasting. We have one of the people we interviewed. His parents were one of the few television. Remember, was really early, young in the 1950s, and his mother was actually a producer on what is it? What's my line? What was the show, Andrea? Again,
It was Candid Camera.
yeah, Candid
Love
Camera.
that.
But they both realized they had to quit, not because they had really been communists, but they just were sure they were going to lose their job. And they went and became chicken farmers. And the FBI came to their chicken farm, and the man wasn't young, but we interviewed, who was his parents, said he's scared when the FBI came, and his father said, "Don't worry, communist chickens don't make headlines." The FBI is looking for headlines. So it was
Right.
those
Good point.
stories we were looking about for kids or any adults to realize history is is happening to you. And one reason I love writing with Andrea is she always says, and you're talking about what's happening now in the United States, you can't read ahead in history. You really
Right.
don't know what is going to happen. But it is
True
still
enough.
fun to read about the what did happen and how people got through it. But
You
Yeah.
you really you take it, take it, take it. This is how we write together.
Yeah. It just made it. Um, no, I'm sorry. Keep going, Liz.
No, keep going, hon.
Can I interject, please,
Sure.
if that's okay? So,
We're
I
all doing
and
it.
that's yeah. So I'm just one of the crowd. Many lifetimes ago, I was a high school history teacher, and one of the things that I ran into is as the year is about to end, you kind of start to speed up the curriculum because you want to get to the Cold War. So there were times when the year would end and we only started the Cold War, we didn't get through it. And so when I heard about your book, I'm like, this is great. We could have used something like this because I always felt like I let the kids down by not covering the Cold War. But the point I wanted to make is to the best of my ability, when I started reading your book, I, as much as I could, I kind of tried to pretend like I didn't know anything, that I was a 16, 18-year-old person. And I've heard of the Cold War, but I don't know anything. So I'm starting to read it. And my biggest question was, could this book convey the paranoia, the fever pitch, in a lot of instances, the outrageousness of some of these accusations, like Cam was saying when our former listeners' parents were in front of the committee. I mean, jokes were being made because to some people this was so ridiculous. It was the equivalent of what people our age would call jumping the shark. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Having said that, you were right. There were people that lost their jobs. They had their lives ruined. There was one part in your book about even getting a fishing license. I mean, this got ridiculous real fast. And I'm sure it was different in different states, but the fear was real. And what really made it come home for me was that fear was kind of used against Jewish people, against blacks, against Latino Americans, against women, against basically if you were not a white male, you could potentially be a target. And I'm just going to not even touch the fact that things haven't changed all that much in this country. And that's very unfortunate, but that's obviously something this country needs to work on. But I really wanted to thank you because I really think you were able to explain with a lot of the different stories, just how insane and how paranoid people were. And of course, there's McCarthy trying to use this. Who knows what he really believes, but he's using this to get headlines and to get press because that's how you get reelected and that's how you get power. And that's all he was trying to do. Just real quick, and this is the last thing on this. To what degree do you think McCarthy really believed that he was saving the country versus, oh, I found something that maybe I can ride all the way to the White House?
I think it really was both. I
Mm,
think he loved the spotlight so much, and once he found a horse he could ride, but he wasn't as cynical, I don't think, and because he would have stayed in power like Hoover for 50 years. Remember,
right.
McCarthy's star rose and fell very quickly. And
Yeah.
I'm somebody old enough to remember the McCarthy era and my parents watching the McCarthy hearings on television. I always thought it was about communism. I forgot or didn't know that it was about Joe McCarthy's aide, Roy Cohn, who then, of course, did go on to work with Trump, trying to keep a young man out of the draft who was his favorite person to work with.
Right.
So the ironies and the weird things about history is what we try to remind kids to look for, and then you'll find the humor like you're trying to find, and you'll
Hmm.
find what makes it alive. And when you ask your parents about it, you'll find those little nuggets that make it seem funny and alive and livable.
Because it
You
was
know,
lived. Because
yes.
it was real people. In all of my years of teaching, I think one of the reasons that people don't like history is everybody's so dumb. Can't they see what's going to happen? I mean, my God, when when the pilgrims arrived, why did they give them corn? I mean, why didn't they send them on their way?
Right.
Why didn't they know? Well, you don't
Hindsight.
read the next chapter. You just
Exactly.
don't.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I agree. But one of the arguments that we always make for why we study history is because, well, I think it was Mark Twain that says it doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. I mean,
Yeah.
you can
Patterns.
see patterns throughout history. Like you can see the same sorts of stories play out over and over again with division, with inequality, with people grasping for power, the rise of populist leaders who talk a load of bullshit, but they understand how to zero in on the fears of the people. Many fears which have been manufactured. Some are real, but many are manufactured by propaganda experts to get the people to support this candidate or that party, whatever it is. And you mentioned Roy Cohn and Trump again, which is why I think the timing of your book is fantastic. Although you don't touch on it in the book, but there is that Sebastian Stan film that's out at the moment that focuses on this. We've talked about it for years. Um, you had the guy, Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's right hand man through all of this, goes on, for people who somehow don't know, to basically be Trump's mentor in how to use the legal system, how to weaponize the legal system to his advantage, and how to just pick an argument and stick to it, deny, 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 to which Trump has now ridden all the way to the presidency, not once, but twice. And the more you understand about Roy Cohn and you understand his connection to Trump, and then you think about how how much of a frothiness the American public had been built up into over communism. They don't refer to them as communists really today. Today it's radical leftists. When I read the the conservative subreddits and media channels, it's the radical leftists that are the problem, according to them. Trump has said that he's talked about in his last campaign the internal enemies that are the biggest threat, how he's going to crack down, he's going to deport all of these people, not just the immigrants, but the members of the media, Smith, the prosecutor. I mean,
Mm.
the same rhetoric. I mean, people talk, people in the campaign that towards the end, the Harris campaign was referring to him as a fascist, and some of his former chiefs of staff and generals were referring to him as proto-fascist or potential fascist. But I see more commonalities, not with fascism, but with the McCarthys, with that sort of the American
Demagogues.
style of yes, exactly. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we can see a lot of these patterns repeating in the United States today, and it's not the first time, and probably won't be the last time.
No, it
But
won't. But I think
it's true that there are that this is where you started, that there's an aspect of history which is that humans are humans are humans, and same driving forces and same fears are present as part of uh, the psyche of human beings. But there is such a thing as historical specificity. And the fact that this happened at the moment that it happened after a war that had shaken the world, that it happened, I mean, that it happened after a giant depression that had made everyone around the world question the basic values of capitalism. I mean, all of those things are specific, and I think that to understand a moment you have to look at the way those things balance.
and the way
Hmm.
also the cracks get in. I mean, one of the we do start our book with a librarians in Indiana state legislature trying to ban Robin Hood because he stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and that's the communist line. So, but on the other hand, the kids in Indiana gathered chicken feathers, and Andrea loves to talk about how easy it is to gather. So you can take it from there, take the pillows off.
Yeah, so they got annoyed. This is something that I do really love. And so they decided to go out and gather feathers, like Robin Hood's feather in his hat. And so they went to a chicken farm where it's easy to get feathers because there are a lot of feathers. And they stuffed a few bags, which is easy because you can fit a lot of feathers into a pillowcase. And they took them back and they dyed them green in honor of Robin Hood. And then they dumped them off the balcony of the state legislature. That
Nice.
you have
And
to
they were
love it.
and they were afraid when the FBI came, but I think you have to. You talked about your friend who was called before the House of Un-American Activities. One of the things we loved writing about, and it was way before McCarthy, or at least a year or two, when they called in the Hollywood writers. And again, it was union busting for Walt Disney. But writers are pretty funny, and most Congress people aren't. Al Frankenstein. Uh, and yes, they put them in jail, but on the other hand, if you read the transcripts, they are incredibly funny. And that was
Mm.
one of our lines. You certainly learned, who you want to call before a hearing. So,
And it's not Hollywood writers.
yeah, the
Exactly.
cracks of light that do get in, and without being a Pollyanna about it, I know how horrible things can happen.
Mhm.
But you have to also accept the humor of people who go through that. That's why we love interviewing people who live through it, because they give us that mix.
Right.
If you don't really talk to people who live through history, you do think it's all, as Andrew said, set out in stone and was always going to be that way.
And it's
Good
boring.
point.
That
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's boring.
Yeah.
That's
And
one reason
I
we
did love.
fly on the wall. We wanted you to feel like you were a fly on the wall of history. And
I like that.
it's like a script, because you don't want to be just given monolithic text to read.
Right.
You
Names
want
and dates.
voices. You want
Exactly.
voices.
Yeah.
yep.
Mm.
Sorry, Cam.
And I did love your Robin Hood analogy there too. And I guess this is sort of what I'm trying to get at with then and today. This idea of anyone who tries to take something from the rich and give it to the poor is going to be chased down by the rich. And I do believe that was the sort of the basis of the Cold War fear in the United States, was the fear of the rich, that the poor, the working classes, the proletariat might rise up and decide they wanted better incomes, unions,
Yes.
healthcare, better education, more control over the electoral system.
And it was
And
black.
that,
I'm sorry, it
sorry,
was
yep,
black soldiers coming back from World War II who had been told they had defeated the worst racism in
Right.
the world,
Right.
fighting Nazism, and actually had seen concentration camps, and then they came back and weren't allowed to buy a house, and that also was something that Hoover and was very afraid of. And
But with
the
reason, because by
Good
the
point.
1940s, Black people were organizing.
yeah,
I
Hmm.
mean, there were political, it by that point, there was organized resistance, and they wanted to break it up quickly.
Yeah.
and then we, another one of our shows, we did a long series on the war on drugs and the history of the war on drugs, and how much of that was based on racism and fear of immigrants. They were Harry Anslinger after the FDR shut down the ban on alcohol, needed to find someone else to go and target, and he hated jazz musicians and he hated Mexicans, and the commonality was they smoked weed. So then they decided to go after that as an easy way to target them. Um, but yeah, and so you look at what's happening in the United States today, the current election, the amount of billionaires that got behind Trump, the frothiness about immigrants and radical leftists, all being supported by the richest of the rich in the United States, that are creating the frothiness around, and just the anger and the vehemence about everything from immigrants to woke politics, just trying to create a little bit of a nicer society and a little bit more fairness and a little bit more consideration for people on the margins gets demonized. Immigrants get
Remember,
demonized.
we're in the field of children's books, which is being attacked from every
Yeah.
side, from trying to you know, show children a little of the world as they see it,
Mm,
and
mm,
children and adults, you know those people who speak the truth to you. You can hear it honestly.
mm, mm,
And I that that value and that humor, you quoted the Monty Python at the beginning, but that really does help you get to how to get through bad times, but also what's the real truth in history. And a lot of it is not funny, but it helps you survive. That humor
mm.
helps you get through it. And otherwise, if you look at it all as just something black and horror, why bother? But the kids, the kids are funny and people are funny.
Exactly.
And
Mm,
you don't know what will happen next.
My
You
favorite
can't
Exactly.
humor.
predict what will happen next. And that's a really important part of it. And that's the exciting part about history, is that at any moment you don't know what's going to happen next. And they didn't had no idea. They didn't have any idea any more than we do about what we know. We're in a time of stress and tension. We know something's going to happen. We know
mm.
that we're on the edge of some kind of social change, but we don't know what kind, and we don't know when, and we don't know where it's going to come from.
Exactly.
Mm,
And I can prove that. If I could go back to something Cam was saying a second ago, one of the things that the elites did, which of course was very clever, maybe obviously so, but they used the concept of patriotism. Oh, we're Americans, we don't do communism. So free stuff from the government, that's not us. That's not what made this country great. Just all these different lies and anything to keep unions down, to keep demands down. And for the four of us sitting here right now having this conversation, we all lived through the second half of the Cold War. We were all alive in the 80s. Just picture for a moment someone is able to bring Ronald Reagan back to life, explain to him what happened in the last 48 hours, and have him go, wait, let me get this right. The Republican leader is either pro-Russian or neutral to the Russian, or he's okay with them attacking other countries, to somehow maybe to claw back the Russian Empire from the Cold War. That would blow his mind. So just for me, going from the 1980s that the Russians are pure evil to, they're not so, North Korea, not so bad. I mean, he would die again. But again, the politicians do or say whatever they need to say. And the one thing, I never thought anything would trump national, no pun intended, I never thought anything would trump nationalism, but it turns out that maybe the cult of personality is the one thing that's more powerful. And I think maybe future politicians will remember this and use it in the future. But certainly during the Cold War, nationalism, patriotism was used to try to beat down these people, like Ken was saying a second ago, who were asking for some very basic things. Hey, wouldn't it be nice if life was just a little more fair? Not easy, just a little more fair. And the elites who have most of the money could not get behind that.
No, that was one of the reasons we used, we start with the end of World War II and Robert Oppenheimer, who, the father of the bomb and the father of the movie that made so much money a couple of years ago.
Right.
but but it's exactly what he felt in the late 30s when about his students in California. And
Mhm.
then, of course, but he also, see, I love the mix of history. He also had a tremendous ego and a tremendous mind.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
wanted to be, to see if he could build the bomb. So it's very hard to say it's completely just it's just this or just that. And I love the mix of history. I love the liveliness of it. And that's, I think, what we try to get into our books, because otherwise if we're bored, we won't want to work on it. And if we're
Good point.
bored, you aren't going to want to read it.
Right, exactly.
You know, we try to encourage people subtly to understand the idea of ambivalence. That
Yeah.
that two things can be happening at the same time. That
Hmm.
there are different perspectives on things. This is a really uncomfortable feeling, as we've just had ample witness of. People would like to, be sure it is this, and
Well,
it's hard.
Well, we've
Yes.
tried to write it as a script that we often give it to people. I mean, I love the woman, her father, and you were right, he was a Jewish scientist, um, somewhat towards the end of the McCarthy era. But she had written to J. Edgar Hoover asking if she loved Nancy Drew, so she thought she'd be a very good FBI agent.
Right.
And somebody in the FBI wrote her back and said, no one else sent us a poem. She had written a poem. Uh, but unfortunately, we don't take any women, but you could be, a secretary or come work for us. Within months, there was a fear in her home. She remembers being lying in bed, just knowing the whisperings, and her father had lost a job, not even because he had been a communist in the 30s, because he had gone to City College, which was the same college where the Rosenbergs went at the same
That's all it
time.
took. Yeah.
Mm,
So we love and look for those kind of stories that make you
mm.
realize this is real history that's happening. And she had both. She both wanted to be an FBI agent and had to live through the fear in her parents' house.
Yeah.
Mm.
And she
Can I just
wasn't.
say,
And
Go ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead,
please.
Cam.
okay,
Should
I'll I'll
You
be
go,
She was
quick. I
Cam.
was just going to
she
say, I was just
she wasn't the first girl who wrote to the FBI. They had a pamphlet, and they sent her back a pamphlet on how girls can support the FBI. So this was their standard reply.
Right. Jeez.
And Ray mentioned Ronald Reagan before, of course. I don't think you mentioned this in the book, but Ronald Reagan was a secret informant to the House Un-American Committees. He was informing on his fellow actors. While he was the head of the Actors Guild, he was
Mhm.
informing on other actors
Yep.
that he suspected were communists. And then you do touch on the irony that they were going after suspected homosexuals because they believed that homosexuals were easy targets for the communists because their homosexuality could be revealed. They could be blackmailed over the fact they were homosexuals. Meanwhile, of course, Roy Cohn and J. Edgar Hoover has for
Mhm.
long been rumored to have been a closeted homosexual, but that didn't matter. They went after homosexuals
And
anyway.
it was even worse because neither Truman in our eyes and our Eisenhower were totally bad people or enemies. But nonetheless, to prove they were more anti-communist and to get away from the accusations, many more people lost their jobs because Truman, who really did believe that most people who worked for the government was loyal, felt that he had to give Hoover a free hand to go after people in the State Department. And then Eisenhower, even though McCarthy was in his own party and was plotting to bring him down, and Eisenhower, who had done D-Day, and Andrea often talks about that. If you can win World War II, you're pretty good at strategy, and he was, because his strategy brought him down. But nonetheless, he was the one who went after who let Hoover go after the homosexuals. It was after 52, after Eisenhower was elected, the lavender scare really went after anti-communists. And I think if you're going to both study history and like it, you have to understand how as ambivalent. I'm not sure, let Andrea take the ambivalence away, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And the consequence of this sacking of so many people in the State Department was that they got rid of all of the Vietnam language speakers. And this turned out to be a really big problem by the end of the 1950s, the fact that they did not have the linguists that they needed because too many of them had been fired.
And
Well, like you,
we have quotes from the first woman who was going to be an admiral, and she decided to turn it down because she was afraid they would come after her as a lesbian, and then her family would know. Remember, this was the 50s and 60s, and she was afraid to have the prominence that becoming the first woman admiral would give her.
Mm,
So it's those details we look for to make what we're writing feel
come to
alive
life,
to you as you're
real life.
reading it,
Mm.
right,
And you mentioned,
rather than we're someone who knows the answers. We don't, but we know to
right.
look for the voices.
and just to wrap it up, you mentioned Truman, and it's something that we've talked about a lot over the years is when the Republicans started to refer to Truman and Roosevelt before him as soft on communism. After the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt was accused of being soft on Stalin during the negotiations. So the soft on communism moniker became something that had to pushed the Democrats further and further towards cracking down on things that, yeah, as you've pointed out and we've talked about in the past, according to the Truman biographers, he didn't really believe
No.
that they had been infiltrated to any great degree by communists, but he felt like he had to go along with it again because all politics is local, is domestic. If he wanted to, the Democrats had any chance of winning the next election, they needed to look hard and tough on communism, and that then also led into not just what was happening at home, but his conversations and discussions with Stalin at Potsdam and afterwards, the relationship between the US, he had to act like he was tough and hard, which drove a greater wedge between the any attempts at diplomacy between the Soviet Union and the United States, and which had massive consequences during the Cold War. They couldn't sit down and talk um, as world leaders, like I think Stalin had been able to do with FDR. He felt like they were able to get along, but he couldn't get along with anyone who came after him because of the whole soft on communism thing.
Yeah.
And you have to remember that none of us are pure. We all honestly, you know, that's that ambivalence, and we hold on to it as we write, because otherwise you get on a high horse and you're off into the sunset and you've lost the story and you've lost um to us anyhow, I think what's real about living through history. Andrea, why don't you take that from now?
When we write, often we reach these points where one of us will say, I don't know what we're doing anymore. I lost the story. I'm confused. And we go back and try and figure it out again. And that's also sort of like you go back and you look at it again. I mean, and it looks a little different. And if you keep looking at it, and we encourage people to keep looking, then you begin to see more, and you begin to see threads that maybe you want to pull out and consider further, and maybe even
We
apply to
have people
contemporary events.
Yeah, we have people read our book as a script. We love them to act it out, and we make the teachers act it out with them. I mean, whether it's high school,
Oh, I like
college,
that.
or in a bookstore.
Ki-
It's not just the kids. Everybody gets to, be one of our characters. And I think, and then we encourage them to try to write like that.
You
You
know,
review, and find that little something that interests you and make a little scene of it. It'll come
mhm,
alive. You have to write a scene. It'll be much more alive than if you can write therefore
right.
they.
Mm.
Yeah,
I
because it's a human
remember,
story.
as a teacher, if I would sit on the edge of the desk and say, okay, now I'm going to explain it, everybody would settle down like, like kids' first story. And
Right.
they knew that I was going to tell them a story. The other point that we try and make all the time is that everybody talks about quotes and what does it mean to have sources.
We have 300
And
notes in our book. We do.
Mm,
but here's the thing, people lie. I mean, you can quote them,
mm,
but it doesn't mean what they're saying is true. And that somehow, gets lost, but it's pretty
right.
important.
Yeah.
Mm.
Can I just say
Yeah, I
real
think that's
quick?
an important thing to remember.
Absolutely, yeah. You have to consider not only the source, but then the person. I know it's been about an hour. I very much thank you for your time,
You're
ladies, and for
very
this
welcome to
book.
cut this as you if you.
No. It's been great. I just wanted to say this to give you some feedback. I had my 16-year-old daughter read this book because I figured, oh, it's a young adult. Let me get her true take. And she reads the book and she comes back and I start to pepper her with questions and she tells me to be quiet. And she goes, I loved the analogy between comparing witches to communists. And then she stopped and she goes, how do I prove I'm not a witch? To which I said, how does someone prove they're not a communist? And that was the whole point. They can't prove it. They are guilty by what de facto, whatever, and their lives are now ruined. I mean, it was
No,
the perfect
you
storm
try
of
and
fear.
drown her. You try and drown her in the river, Ray. If she floats, she's a witch, and you burn her.
That's
If
why.
she
That's why.
drowns, she was innocent. And we've always known that. Have you not been paying
That's
attention?
that's why I don't
And
let
that's
Cam
what,
near my
But
daughters.
By
only
the
with
way,
girl
so
children.
Girls,
yeah,
exactly.
by the way, Sophie is a witch. We
She
all
is.
know that. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
that's
don't
the
even need to
irony
go through
here.
the exercise.
tell her
Yeah.
tell her thank you that she got our book as much as anyone we wanted to.
She
I
got the
certainly
point
will.
we wanted to make. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you.
Last question, and I'll let you go. What are your hopes for the book? What are your ambitions for the book? What do you hope it achieves?
uh, that that you understand that people can survive a period like that when you're accused being a witch hunt, that you or even if you don't survive, you're that there are cracks in history, and also that not that it's fun, but boy is it full of life.
Mm, literally.
It just boils over with life. That's
Right.
why you love history. And if it's given to you without the life, boy, is it dead.
Mm.
Yeah. Name and dates.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a nice place to wrap it up. The book is published by Macmillan, I believe,
Yes.
or Pan Macmillan,
Macmillan
as
Moore
they
book, yes.
are
We only have
here.
a couple publishing houses left, but it's
You're right.
People can find it on Amazon or all good bookstores. Go
and in
and we'll
your
put a link to it in
library.
our notes. And the
Library.
libraries, yeah, big fan of the library.
We are too.
Exactly.
The Witch Hunt,
Yep.
Why we
The
have
Cold War, Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare by Andrea Ballas and Elizabeth Levy, illustrated by Tim Foley. Highly recommend it for anyone, but particularly for people that have, excuse me, people with children. You want to get them interested in history, but also, as you pointed out, I think teenagers that may be paying attention to what's happening with the recent election might be full of fear and trepidation for what lies ahead. As you point out, it's a way of pointing out, look, there have been difficult times before and we have survived them. Life goes on, the world goes on, and hopefully we'll figure it out.
Exactly. Thank you,
Hopefully.
ladies.
Thank you so much. It really,
Thank you.
It's been fun with listening to some of your podcasts. It's really been interesting. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
I apologize for that. No one should ever listen to our podcast.
All right.
Thank you. Have a good
Okay.
night. Enjoy the rest
Thank
of
You
your
too.
week.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.